the Jaipur Literature Festival. I'm sure it's going to be another extremely interesting day today, but before we begin the day's proceedings, as is customary, it's time for me to thank our sponsors. So first off, I would like to thank Z Entertainment, the title sponsor at this year's Jaipur Literature Festival, Google, the British Airways, the Mahindra Humanities Centre for providing us with this lovely venue, Ford, Rajasthan Tourism, for those of you who are visiting Rajasthan for the first time, you can thank them for all the beautiful forts and sites you've seen. Public Diplomacy, they'll make sure that everything's in order if you are from foreign shores. National Jute Board for all the beautiful bags that they've made for us this year. The American Centre and the British Council. The Jan Michalski Foundation, our official venue partner, the Diggy Palace, for providing us with this venue. Brew Gold, for keeping you all awake when you're feeling sleepy. Vodafone, for trying to not let the signal jam when there are 200,000 people inside the venue. Clark's Amer, for the beautiful music stage they set up that you will, I hope most of you attended, and I hope you will be attending today and tomorrow. Coca-Cola, Fortis Hospitals. For all those of you who don't know, Fortis Hospitals is providing healthcare. There's a healthcare center right near the front if any of you are in need. Penguin, Dove, the Glenlivet, Kingfisher, our official bookstore partner, Full Circle Bookstore. It's right near the Charbagh in front in case any of you want to purchase books. Le Meridian Hotels, the Rambagh Palace, Dainik Bhaskar, DNA, Hindustan Times, Rajasthan Patrika, The Telegraph, Radio Mirchi, and Twitter. Our official ticketing partners, Kaizunga.com, the decor partner, Royal Treasure, and our hospitality partners, ITC Hotels, Narayan Nivas, Rajasthan Royals, and the Oberoi Raj Vilas. Thank you. So now, to get on, I'm going to now introduce the first session of the day on Hangover Sunday of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival 2014 is called Love and War, Literature, Danger and Passion in the Second World War. We have readings by Alison MacLeod, Lara Feigel, and they will be introduced by Artemis Cooper. So without further ado, I pass it on to Artemis to begin.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and may I say how lovely it is to be here in Jaipur, even though the weather is a bit more like London at the moment, which is sad, but there we are. Dr. Lara Feigel is a lecturer in English at King's College, London, where her research is centred on the 1930s and the Second World War. She's the author of Literature, Cinema and Politics, 1930 to 1945, and her most recent book, The Love Charm of Bombs, looks at the experience of 5 writers during the Blitz, the bombing of London in 1940. And Professor Alison MacLeod teaches contemporary fiction and creative writing at the University of Chichester. She's published collections of short stories, and her last novel, Unexploded, is set in Brighton on the south coast, where she now lives. The Love Charm of Bombs is a work of history. Unexploded is a novel. But both these books, from different angles, explore the states of mind produced by the threat of imminent bombardment and invasion, and the ways in which people found release from the pressure of their anxiety and apprehension. So first of all, we have Alison MacLeod. Alison.
Thank you very much, Artemis, and thank you everyone for coming. It is... You're picking me up okay? No. It's just on sound. If necessary, I can project out. You picking me up now? No?
That's
no?
better,
Okay.
is it?
All right, so there we go. You hear me fine now? Yeah. No.
You might have to have the handheld, but I can hold it for you if you like.
Okay. Shall I come out here? It's all right. You're getting it? Okay, let's do this.
Do you want me to hold it for you?
I think I'm okay. I think that's on. All right, so there we go. Okay, I'll try it. I'll try this way. Thank you everyone for coming out this morning on a chilly morning. It's absolutely lovely and a great honour to be here in Jaipur, and a particular honour to be doing this session with Lara and with Artemis. Unexploded takes us back to, well, the opening takes us back to May 1940, which was a particular low point in the Second World War for the English, for the British. If you remember that we just had the evacuation from France of the British forces, that gloomy retreat, but also what was called the miracle of the little boats. And so the passage I'm about to read you, I'm going to read you two short passages, the first one quite short. And it's just really to set the scene. We're in Brighton, as Artemis said, on the south coast of England. And it's a particularly weird sort of year that's about to come. It's a year in which everyone along the south coast, and certainly Brighton as a small town really in those days, were literally waiting for the Germans, for the enemy to walk up their beaches. So there was not only the fear of bombardment from above, which hadn't quite started yet, but was coming. But there was also, along the coast, this very, very strange and almost surreal wait for the enemy to make a physical invasion, an amphibious landing. So the town really for a year was in a sort of suspended state of waiting and a sort of charged year of tension. And that's the backdrop for the novel. So I'm just going to read you the opening couple of pages to set the scene. I think I can manage this, Artemis. The talk that May afternoon was of the rockfall at the Undercliff. A fisherman's dory had been buried along with his dog, and the collapse had taken part of the seawall with it. The news, though negligible compared with the reports from across the Channel, was repeated and wondered at in town as if the nerves of the population ran like thin fuses through the cliff-lined strata of chalk and flint. She stepped from the dim cave of the shop into a dazzle of sea light, and turning left rather than right, walked briskly north up Ship Street, away from the prom where onlookers still gathered in the hope of seeing another boat safely returned. The music from the empty rides on the pier receded. She shifted the weight of the purchases in her arms. At no point did she turn back to take in this spectacle on the beach, for she didn't want to see what the man in the shop had described, the ghostly flotilla of little boats, some pocked by gunfire, listing oddly around the old carousel. She crossed Church Street and hurried through the grounds of the pavilion, past its dream of domes and minarets. There was no time to stop in the gardens or to take tea at one of the sunlit tables. She had to be home before Philip, her son. It's what everyone said these days. Routine was the thing. At the level, the town's public common, she lowered her basket and let herself rest for a few minutes in the meager shade of an elm. Artemis, maybe I might just give a hold of my thing. On the green ahead, a group of old men played a ruminative game of bowls, where the schools had not yet emptied, and even the benches around the boating pond were empty except for a young mother and her runaway toddler. Locally, the level was known as such for the simple reason that little else in Brighton was level. Most of the town swooped recklessly skyward, as if it were a dizzying ride that had been plucked from a pier and dropped carelessly onto the coast. On three sides of the town centre, hills climbed north towards the wheat fields of Sussex and the hump of Ditchling's ancient beacon, west towards the rail terminus and the deep, untamed valley of Devil's Dyke, and east towards Race Hill, the racecourse, and the town's perennial gypsy encampments. For all its efforts at gentility down the centuries, Brighton had never managed to escape the wild excesses of its highs and lows. Like the level, Park Crescent, where my characters live, and its gated acres of garden lay in the flat bowl of the town. But that hot, simmering spring, the bowl was less a bowl than a crucible in which the events of the year to come, their vagaries and intensities, would catalyze into the hard, unyielding metal of the inevitable. Fear was an infection, airborne, seaborne, rolling in off the channel, and although no one spoke of it, no one was immune to it. 50 miles of water was a slim moat to an enemy that had taken 5 countries in 2 months, and Brighton, regrettably, had for centuries been hailed as an excellent place to land. So that's just an introduction for those of you who don't know Brighton to the sort of sense of it and the geography of it in this peculiar year that began in 1940 of waiting. The story is about that year of tension, that particular peculiar year for the coast of England, the south coast. It's also a portrait of a marriage coming apart. So I suppose the novel is both about bombs that lie unexploded, but also emotions that lie unexploded, and as the course of the novel unfolds, will sort of detonate. And Evelyn and Geoffrey Beaumont are a fairly sort of stable couple, it seems, as the novel opens, but little by little, their relationship unravels as the events of that year take over. And one of the catalyzing events is their encounter with a German artist, a German Jewish artist called Otto Gottlieb. Otto Gottlieb arrives in Brighton to be interned at the enemy alien camp. Because he was a German Jewish refugee, like many in that position who arrived in England, arrived in Britain in 1940, many had just fled Germany or managed to get out of the German labor camps, as Otto did, my character, and arrived in Britain quite brutalized, only to be collected up again, rounded up, and interned in a series of enemy alien camps. I discovered that there had been such a camp in my own hometown of Brighton, and that really fascinated me. Otto's background is that he was an artist, one of the degenerate artists from the 1937 Degenerate Art Exhibition, when any artist, both Jewish or non-Jewish, had, if their work was deemed by the Third Reich to have had Jewish Bolshevik leanings, their work and they themselves, in some cases, were rounded up. The canvases were put on display throughout Germany, and they were downed entirely as pieces of work. Many of them were later burned by the Third Reich. So Otto arrives as a degenerate German artist into England, and I'm going to read you a little bit. Okay, so this is a scene in which Otto, the so-called degenerate artist, thank you, okay, I'm very well served here, thank you, in which he meets my main character, Evelyn Beaumont, the wife of Geoffrey Beaumont. And I should say Geoffrey, as well as being a leading banker in the town, is also superintendent of the enemy alien camp where Otto is captive. So this is a meeting, one of the more open meetings between Otto and Evelyn. This is Otto, he brushed rainwater from the bench and spread out his jacket. She demurred, was it his only jacket? Then sat and made room for him on it. A current hummed in the narrow gap between their bodies. Their shoulders nudged. She turned her face to the sun. He studied the homeless men under the elms. In that moment, she felt to him like a charm against that fate. Her questions came one after another, as if her previous restraint had been nothing more than ice on a thin puddle. Why, she wanted to know, had he tried to drown himself? Why had he been so rude to her at first? Why did his passport read degenerate? Why had he been in a prison camp in Germany? Did he have a wife, a family? Had he ever been a con man or a spy? Which painters did he admire? Had he truly liked the waves? Had he found any other work yet in Brighton? How then was he living? You, Mrs. Superintendent, are worse than any tribunal, Otto said. Her face fell. Please don't call me that. 3 final questions, he said. Did he despise her, she wondered. She closed her eyes like a seaside mind reader, and the question she most wanted to ask came. Who did that to your back? His back is badly scarred. How did it happen? But it was a curiosity too far. So she says instead, how did you come by the counterfeit money? He stiffened. He resented the need to explain, and yet he wanted her to understand, to know that he was not an undesirable. As I said to your husband, they still have, I imagine, a counterfeiting operation at Sachsenhausen. The plan, at least at that time, was to weaken the British economy by dropping counterfeit notes from planes. When they do, the hope is that those who find it will be greedy enough to use it. Like you were, she turned to him. Yes, he met her eyes. They stuffed me with those notes when I left Berlin. It amused them greatly. When I arrived in England, I was desperate. I couldn't find work. I had nowhere to live. For a long while, no one would agree to contact the bishop for me. I was terrified of being locked up again. I used the forgeries as sparingly as I could, out of fear of being caught, I should add, not out of virtue. And then you were, she said. I was caught, locked up again, by my husband. Yes, he rubbed paint from his fingers, so to speak. Why did you paint Mr. Pierazzini? He shrugged. No death should go unmarked, and countless do. And why did you paint the stump of his finger? Is that the third and final question? She smiled. It is a subpoint of my second question. Was it wrong of me, he asked. On the contrary, no. And she held his gaze. He was a tailor, did you know that? Highly skilled. But I suppose it only takes one careless moment, and he laughed. His old, rancorous laugh again. She bristled. I only mean, Otto, that no one deliberately puts their fingers in a pair of shears. No, he said, others do it for you. She turned, her eyes wide. Mussolini's men, he said, stormed his shop in Pisa in 27. She bowed her head. Why, he said, do you think he and his wife came to Britain? And why, she wondered, did she always understand everything too late? He stood. I must go. The sight of her walking away from him would be too much. She'd smile, of course. She might turn to wave. But even as they'd sat speaking more frankly than they ever had, he'd blamed her inwardly and fiercely for the devastation of his heart, for her blindness to it. Yes, forgive me, she said, rising, her thoughts reeling. I've kept you too long. He pretended to assess the sky. I'll get a little work done before I lose the light in the church. She touched his arm. Final question. He winced, hardly able to bear it, her touch. Her lipstick had worn off, her silly hat was askew, or even more askew. Her hair was unrolling in the April breeze, and she patted at it anxiously as she felt his eyes taking her in. La petite bourgeoise, he thought, but she was achingly lovely. Of course, as chance would have it, she was also the superintendent's wife, and he was too many things. He, Otto, was a Jew, a refugee, an enemy alien, a degenerate, and an undesirable. One didn't want to be too many things. One was meant to be singular and pure. Any fantasy he might have entertained about her was as banal as it was tormenting. Life, after all, was simply to be endured. She had only taken a kind interest in his case. She had touched his sleeve. She'd spoken compassionately. But even as he schooled himself in the facts of the matter, a pair of sparrowhawks appeared overhead, and in that moment, as she looked up too, her face alight, he felt the force of their lives tangle. Look! Her hat was sliding off her head. I used to see them over Race Hill on my way to the infirmary. The mail was roller coasting on the thermals. We have these birds too in Berlin, he said. They're sacred in German myth. They live in the grove of the gods. I used to watch them as a boy. They're the only birds of prey I know of that live in the city and hunt. He's trying to win the female. Fantasy talk, he thought. More fantasy. Why did he do this to himself? Third question, she said, and picked up his jacket from the bench, shaking out its creases. What is the subject of your fresco? You never said. He looked past her coolly. The old yearning was overwhelming him again. He had to repel her, to undo the force of her. Bathsheba. He tossed the word carelessly into the breeze. The adulteress. Quite the subject for a little working-class Church of England parish, don't you think? He heard her start to speak, to utter something bland and courteous, but he wouldn't have it. Blood rushed to his head. The old ringing in his ears returned. His shirt clung to him. How pointless everything was. The April sky was crashing in, blue and too bright, and he had to interrupt, to speak over whatever it was she was so decorously uttering. Indeed, it is astonishing, he said with determined indifference, that the bishop ever agreed to the idea. You see, Mrs. Beaumont, it is not for nothing that my passport is stamped degenerate. I have a knack of falling foul of good society. I wasn't made for it. I have no interest in it. As an artist, I am drawn to actresses, dancers, and whores, the hatless women of this world, and their themes. Women, in other words, who are alive. He flicked something, a fly or a bee, from his sleeve. Thank you for the diversion, he said. As we're nearly at the crescent, forgive me, but I shan't see you home. She stood for long moments and watched him recede, his words scoring the air. She still held his jacket. He had abandoned it to spite. Why had she ever felt glad of his company? Who was he to her? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lara.
Thank you. I think I'll stand. Is that picking up? Can you hear me at the back? Brilliant. So I'm just going to read a very short extract from my book, The Love Charm of Bombs, which picks up a lot of the themes of Alison's book. And I'm going to start, after introducing the book, with a sort of little scene from September 1940, which is just a few months after the May moment described by Alison. But just to introduce the book, it's about 5 writers in London in the Second World War. The most famous, and who you all know, is Greene, author of Brighton Rock, author of The End of the Affair. He was working as an air raid protection warden during the war. All the writers I describe had some kind of job in the civilian defence services protecting London. Everyone was called up at this point, and if people didn't go into the army or the air force, they could take a job protecting the city in some way, because London itself was a kind of battlefront. And lots of writers chose to do that because it enabled them to carry on writing primarily, and sometimes in the eyes of some, even in war, would have said it was because they were a bit cowardly, but who knows. So another one is Henry Greene, whose real name was Henry Yorke, who's a sort of avant-garde writer who was a fireman at this time. Then there was Rose Macaulay, who was an ambulance driver, and Elizabeth Bowen, who was an ARP warden, and then an Austrian called Hilda Spiel, who was an exile in London, who I'm not going to talk about today, but who was very much one of the 5 characters in my book. So just to give you a sense of the scene setting, and I suppose of the way that love and war came together in this period, I'm going to read you a page from the introduction of my book. Like the poets in the trenches, Bowen, Greene, Macaulay, and Yorke were participants rather than witnesses, risking death night after night in defence of their city. The Second World War was a total war. No one escaped the danger, and every Londoner was vulnerable. While the fighting in the First World War took place far away, the bombing of the Second World War was superimposed onto a relatively normal London life. Books were written, parties hosted, love affairs initiated and broken off. But the books, parties and love affairs were infused with the danger of death. Every aspect of life was refracted through the lens of war. Looking back on the Blitz, Elizabeth Bowen described this as a period of lucid abnormality, a moment outside time when she and her friends were afloat on the tideless, hypnotic, futureless today. When a bomb exploded, nearby clocks ceased to function, remaining stuck at the time of detonation. London was a city of shock-stopped clocks, and for its inhabitants, the suspended present created a climate where intense emotions could flourish. It came to be rumoured, Bowen recalled, that everybody in London was in love. Bowen, Greene, Macaulay, Spiel and York floated dangerously on that futureless present. All experienced the war as an abnormal pocket of time. As writers, they observed the strangeness of war imaginatively. London became a city of restless dreams and hallucinogenic madness, a place in which fear itself could transmute into addictive euphoria. To stay in London was to gamble nightly with death, and so each day was unexpected, each moment had the exhilarating but unreal intensity of the last moment on earth. Their public war work became the backdrop for volatile individual private lives. For Bowen, wartime, with its makeshifts, shelvings, deferrings, could not have been kinder to romantic love. Bowen, Greene and York spent the war in the kind of love that blazed with the raging intensity of the fires igniting their city. So that's a bit of background to the book, and now I'm just going to take you briefly, as a kind of cameo moment, through one particular night of the Blitz. And maybe I'll sit down to do this, I think. September the 26th, 1940, and I'm going to take you through this night in the lives of four of them, and I pieced it together from their personal archives and also from the London records, from bombing records, for the city as a whole and for the individual boroughs. So I'll introduce them one by one as they go on duty. So the night starts at 7 o'clock with the blackout. This is now September 1940 is a year into the war. As Alison said, the first year of the war was a very strange time in which everyone was expecting sort of daily. They were waiting for invasion, but nothing happened. It's known as the phony war. It became very anticlimactic and anxious. And then suddenly, in the summer of 1940, bombs started coming, at first by day, and then suddenly, at the, sort of a few days into September, they start every night, all night. And by the 26th of September, which is the night I'm going to describe, everyone across London is exhausted. No one had expected it to be this continual. The air raid shelters weren't really made for people to spend whole nights in them, so no one is managing to get any sleep. But yet, everyone is also surprised that they are coping, that people are sort of finding a way to form a kind of community at this time and to come together and to sort of be resilient. And also that there's, and I suppose what I'm interested in is that for these writers, the general image of London at this time is people sort of drinking tea and being resilient and jolly and singing songs. But my writers are more reckless. They're not drinking tea, they're drinking cocktails. They're sort of sometimes running off into the street to experience the danger. But yet they do share that sense of themselves as part of a sort of resilient, stalwart community and are surprised at their strength. So at 7 o'clock, the blackout starts. The whole city, people sort of pull down blackout curtains over their windows. You're not allowed a chink of light into your house. And at this point, Elizabeth Bowen goes on duty in Marylebone in central London, and at the same time Graham Greene goes on duty in Bloomsbury, just around the corner from Bowen, to make sure, as ARP wardens, air raid protection wardens. Their job is to make sure that there are no chinks in the blackout, to usher people into shelters later as the sirens start, and to be a kind of first port of call for any incidents. So to give you a quick picture of them, starting with Graham Greene. Graham Greene is at this point a very successful writer. He's the author of Brighton Rock. He's sort of a key member of the London literary establishment. And he is in his element in the war because he's someone who has always thrived on danger. As a boy, he is now a manic depressive, and he used to, in order to escape the sort of perpetual boredom of 14, he played Russian roulette with a loaded gun on the common near his house, sort of daring himself to live, because each moment in which the gun wasn't loaded was a chance to feel suddenly grateful to be alive. That then quickly became boring and he stopped doing it, and then spent his 20s, as many writers in this period in England spent their 20s, going off to war zones around the world, looking for danger in Spain or in China. And now he's actually sort of grateful that war has come home. The title of my book, this very strange title, The Love Charm of Bombs, comes from a quote by Graham Greene, where he said in an essay at this time, "The nightly routine of sirens, barrage, the probing raider, the unmistakable engine, where are you, where are you, where are you? The bomb bursts, moving nearer and then moving away, hold one like a love charm." So Greene was sort of charmed by the danger, by the sirens whistling down on them. And it was particularly charming for him because at this early in the war, because people were so scared of invasion, there was a general move to evacuate wives and children from the city. And the male writers I describe all sort of made the most of this in a way and thought, right, we need to send our wives and children to the countryside. And Greene did this and is now finding himself as a bachelor effectively in London and is really rather enjoying having the chance to sort of pursue the few women who are there, enjoying the fact that no one quite knows where anyone is, that if his wife calls and he's not in the house and is in fact in the flat of his mistress Dorothy Glover, he can just tell her that he was sort of out because there was a bombing raid or something. So Greene is really in his element, and particularly in the raids. He's working during the day at the Ministry of Information, but he really comes into his own at night. Then around the corner from him is Elizabeth Bowen, who is also sort of coming into her own at this point. She's not so sort of crazily ecstatic about the raids as Greene, but she really feels that she's the same age as the century, and she feels that she and her century have come of age together in 1940, that suddenly, having always been a bit sort of diffident and not quite knowing where she stood in relation to the world, she feels like she is part of the current of her time. And this is something I think that contrasts, we can talk about later, that contrasts with Evelyn in Alison's novel, who feels sort of left out by war. I think Bowen, and partly because she's working as an ARP warden, because she's kind of involved in the danger and she's protecting people, and she sort of plays a necessary role in this war, she feels like it gives her a sense of purpose. And it's this sense of purpose, again, that leads to the linking of love and war for her, that sort of a few months later in the Blitz, she will fall in love, really with the love of her life, a Canadian diplomat called Charles Ritchie. So Bowen and Greene are on duty as ARP wardens. The blackout has happened, and then at about 8:30, the sirens start, showing that the planes are coming over, that the bombing is about to begin. And their role is to echo the sirens on their whistles to get people locally to go down into the shelter. So the planes arrive and the first bombs start coming down in London. No one quite knows where they're going to land. And now it's time for the firemen and the ambulance drivers to get ready to go on duty. So first Henry York, who writes under the name Henry Greene, is on duty in Westminster, just a few streets down. Really, everyone's in this very small area of central London, and he's just a little bit down from them. And York, like Greene, is a young, successful author. He's very rich. He's from an aristocratic family. They have a sort of big house in the countryside. But he's always liked playing roles. He's never quite comfortable with just being one person. So as an undergraduate at Oxford, just after finishing, he went and worked. His father owns a big factory, and he decided to go and work and sort of pretended to be one of the workers, although the workers obviously never took him completely seriously as one of them. But he liked to think they did, and gave a rather embarrassing interview at this point where he said, "Oh yeah, I don't dress for dinner anymore. The workers, they're my mates, and I'm now one of them." And that sort of phase of his life is over. He then had his sort of bright young thing, society life, after marrying a woman who's kind of colloquially known as Dig in his 20s. And that's, at the same time, he has his sort of alter ego as a writer. And now he has the role of fireman, and he absolutely loves it. He signed up partly wanting to be the man who everyone adored, and then found during the first year of the war that in fact firemen weren't heroes. People sort of spat at them in buses because, given that there were no bombs coming in London, people thought, why aren't you overseas? And now suddenly he's really, again, he's come into his own. Firemen are the heroes of the moment. And people talk about at this time, and he, like Greene, has evacuated his wife and son to the countryside and go and talk. Firemen sort of were on duty for 48 hours and then would have a day off, and he would go from one bar and club to another, and each was sort of more glamorous, with one young girl after another, in a sort of day. He talks about it as a days of giving in his very wonderful wartime novel, Court. And people, I've seen interviews recorded near the end of his life with some of the young women who knew him in the war, and one of them said that each night they used to say to each other, "Who are you going out tonight with, darling? Is it someone you'd like to die with?" And in the case of Henry York, it usually was. So he's there, he's working as a fireman, he's not really scared, he's somehow still caught on that tide of excitement. And tonight, on the 26th of September, his job is to go to the Houses of Parliament in London, which are bombed for the first time. And he gets there to find a sort of raging fire. Obviously, they've got enormously good fire services operating permanently in these major buildings. But still, the windows are smashed out by the glass. And in my book, I have a picture of Richard, the statue of Richard the Lionheart, which sort of stands proud in front of the building. The tip of his sword has been bent by the blast. So it's a great sort of symbol of London under siege, kind of sort of dented but standing firm, much like those pictures of St. Paul's that you've probably seen, sort of surrounded in flames but still resilient. So that's Henry York in Westminster. And then finally, Rose Macaulay goes on duty as an ambulance driver. Her shift tonight starts at 10 o'clock. And Rose Macaulay is the oldest of the writers I'm describing. She's almost 60, which really is too old to be an ambulance driver at this point. They've just passed a rule saying that they shouldn't be over 50, but somehow she's the kind of Englishwoman that always manages to make things work. And one of the rules for being an ambulance driver was that you had to lift a stretcher with a body on it above your head onto a bunk. And I really don't think I could do that. And she was tiny. She was this sort of tiny, wiry woman of almost 60. But somehow she managed to convince them that she was fully capable of doing this. And she's the sort of mad old lady, the sort of English eccentric that you get in sort of novels by Ian Forster. She was always sort of dashing around and climbing ladders and sort of, she loved swimming. So people talked about how whenever she arrived at their house, she'd ask where the nearest place to swim was. And if there wasn't a lake or a sea nearby, she'd go and have a dip in their muddy pond. She was that sort of slightly mad person. But underneath this kind of redoubtable exterior, she was a very passionate woman who, for 20 years, had hidden a secret love affair with a man called Gerald O'Donovan, who was the only man she'd ever loved. He'd been married, he had been a priest and was still a Catholic, and so wasn't prepared to leave his wife. But this was for him also a very serious love affair. And they'd been very happy, they'd had lots of wonderful times together, but on top of all her other madnesses, Macaulay, perhaps not surprisingly, was a crazy driver, although actually having been driving in India, I'm sort of not sure. I think she would have fitted in very well. she would have had a tuk-tuk and been completely unfazed. Because she used to do things, the biggest roundabout in London is Hyde Park Corner, and she used to sort of think nothing of going the wrong way around it in her car and sort of didn't obey any. And one of the problems of this was that when she was driving her lover, Gerald O'Donovan, around the previous two years earlier, she disobeyed a red light and crashed into a van, and he had head injuries which resulted in a stroke, and he's now dying. I mean, he's okay at the moment, but she knows that within the next year he'll be dead, and she blames herself for it. And what is worst about this is that it's a secret affair, and so she can't tell anyone that she's grieving for the impending death of her lover, and so she sort of throws all her sense of loss into the war and is sort of unable to cope with it for the first year, but now is finding that actually driving an ambulance and again kind of being part of the action on the night and feeling responsible for other people is a way to forget about her own sadness. And so just to end with her night, which is really the saddest bit of this night, and ambulance drivers, I think, see the war they see is a lot worse than the war that the firemen see in a way. The firemen see the buildings, the ambulance drivers see the bodies. And she arrives at an incident in Camden Town in the north of London where 2 houses have been completely smashed to the ground. It's just a sort of huge pile of rubble. And she finds 2 families caught underneath this rubble, and the rescue workers are sort of desperately trying to hack them out. And she can hear the children crying, the mothers sort of calling for help. And Macaulay is there for 8 hours, and during this time she passes milk. There's a baby in there. She passes milk to the baby. She reassures the mother and promises her that they're going to all come out. And she herself is covered in dust. All these people are sort of white with dust. The smell, people talk about the smell of explosions, and it's sort of overpowering, the smell of gas, the smell of dust. And then finally, the rescue workers manage to get out a woman of 30-something, and she's injured, and they want Macaulay to take her away with her in her ambulance. And this woman doesn't want to leave her children, who are still trapped under the rubble, but Macaulay promises her that they're almost out, they're going to join her at the hospital. And then she hears the next morning that both children, in fact, were dead. So this is the kind of awful daily reality of the war, but at the same time, you get Graham Greene sort of running around thinking of sirens as love charms. So I think this is something we could pick up on, is the sort of the combination of horror and exhilaration possible at this time.
I mean, it seems to me, listening to this, that in order, as it were, to enjoy, shall we say, somehow see the war as good copy, your writers, the ones that sort of really get into it are the ones that have somehow pushed their responsibilities aside. So Graham Greene has, pushed his sort of wife and kids over there. Rose Macaulay can't get away from the responsibility because she's seeing it every day, and her lover has these terrible injuries that she's responsible for. But I think there is a part, this extraordinary, at the same time we've been hearing about how terrible things are, but there was also the aesthetic of it. London is actually rather beautiful at this time. There's a sort of orange light everywhere. The streets are deserted. And I think these contrasts are really kind of quite extraordinary.
I think certainly the beauty is one thing that enabled these writers to sort of distance themselves from the horror, that all of them were writing about it at the same time as they were experiencing it. And I think for all writers, that however bad things are, the sort of ability at the same time to kind of see it in a detached way is somehow a kind of, Bowen talked about it as a saving resort. And it, as you say, it was beautiful. There were the kind of people talked about it as like a film, the blacked out scenes with the sort of lit up by fire and searchlights. Even the bomb sites were sort of surreal, sort of furniture being strewn. There was one time where the writer Innes Holden was out with a surrealist painter friend, and they saw a tree with a sort of top hat in it and a dress strewn across it. And the painter said to her, this is, of course, we've been painting this sort of thing for years, but it took the world all this time to catch up with us. It's a sort of surreal.
At the same time, we have sort of with your book, Alison, Evelyn, who is absolutely almost destroyed. She does have responsibility. She does have a child.
She does.
And she's living in this kind of numb, kind of the terror of the imminent invasion.
She is. So she feels really quite sort of numbed, quite just sort of flattened by the fear of this imminent invasion. And as I said, I think the sense of somebody literally coming onto land, you know, being 10 minutes away and walking up your street, for her that's an absolutely haunting and surreal experience. And what she doesn't understand, I think she struggles with, is the surrealness with which everyone is supposed to sort of catch up with very, very quickly. So, and for me as a writer, it's certainly, yes, I have to do as a writer, it's you know, you can't take on the Second World War, or any war, in your novel unless you're absolutely attentive to the reality of it. But actually, what interested me, and I think what frightened my main character, Evelyn, is the sense of the surreal. So at one point, reading through local notebooks, local diaries, you know, details like a woman's corset hanging from the tree, you know, this very kind of surreal quality that you're mentioning. And I think that sense of trying to catch up with Virginia Woolf talks about in her diaries, again, this sense of the surreal. Nobody can believe it. Nobody can believe it. And so she said one must forget. But of course she doesn't forget. And she goes on and speaks in a really sort of sharp way through various essays and notebooks about the absolute sort of bleak bizarreness of the war, that somehow everyone else seemed to be merrily, on the surface, getting along with. And Evelyn can't catch up, her brain can't catch up quickly enough. And it's only near the end, I think, when she begins to break out of that sort of numb quality through the kind of collision with Otto and his world.
And it's interesting, I think, that in a way that her fear and Graham Greene's excitement lead to the same thing.
The same thing.
That these love affairs are both, I think we talked about it yesterday, are both the sort of product of a need for comfort and a sort of over-exuberance that comes from the intensity of living each moment as though it might be your last.
Yes, and I know for me, certainly as a writer, I don't know if this is on. Is this on?
I think it is. Okay,
it is okay, okay. Then I think for me as a writer, although Virginia Woolf features, she has a cameo in my novel where she gives a lecture that she actually did give in Brighton in spring 1940, and then there was another lecture scheduled that never happened, very, very sadly, and perhaps, I think, for obvious reasons, in early April. So my characters, when I read Otto and Evelyn, that little scene, they had just arrived, they'd just come out of a lecture at which Virginia Woolf has not appeared because her suicide was in fact the week before, but the news wasn't out yet. So Woolf appears, but really, in terms of the sort of maybe the quality or the feeling of my book, it's Graham Greene who in that sense, I love Greene's, the sense of urgency, the sense of emotional intensity that you get through so much of Greene.
And maybe that's something that Evelyn learns is to sort of to see that the fear can imbue the moment with a kind of potency that she can
grasps hold of.
Later,
she gets, later she really has to sort of, grasp hold of things and sort of, become sturdier and more robust. But yes, she's learning how to live her life essentially in this strange year.
And I think in that sense, in a way, she's most similar to Elizabeth Bowen in my book, who again has I think the sense of sort of suddenly growing up. And that is a terrifying thing, but it can also be very liberating.
Yes.
It's sort of these women who kind of grow up at 40 at the same time as the century, I think, is quite...
Absolutely.
Now, I think perhaps with all so much to think about, we ought to open this up a bit.
Yes,
do you think?
Absolutely.
So if anybody has a question, the lady there, could you please talk loud and I will repeat your question. Oh, you've got a mic, brilliant.
Thank you. Well, I'm very interested because you're obviously young ladies. What on earth induced you to write about the Second World War? What was the attraction?
How interesting. Really
yes, because I lived through it. I was 10 when it ended.
Yes, of course. Well, for me, I think it's in some ways a simple answer. I'm a person living in 2014. Any work of history that I take on in terms of fiction is in fact, for me, it has to be about the here and now. It has to be about our own contemporary preoccupations. And so for me, this novel, examining fear, terror to some extent as well, the notion that we all have, to some extent, lesser or greater, of living with a sense of terror these days. I wanted to examine that, and I had my first sense of it walking through London the day after the bombings in 2005. And in a sense, it was really that day and that sense of fear, which was palpable, of course, in London that day. I wanted to find a way of thinking about fear in our contemporary times. But sometimes it's best to come at things obliquely, rather than to go head on in a more obvious way. So because I also live in Brighton, at the same time was imagining how surreal it would have been to have Germans walking, or the enemy, whoever the enemy is, walking up your beat, which is 10 minutes from my house. Those two things collided and took me to that year.
I think for me it began with the books written by these writers that Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, Elizabeth Bowen's The Heat of the Day, and Henry Greene's Court are three of my favourite novels. And I was interested in the kind of intense lyricism. I think that for all three writers, these are the most sort of lyrical, sensual, strongly felt novels they wrote. And I started reading really out of curiosity about their lives at this time and found them more and more compelling. And was sort of, I'm an academic in an English department, and I was going to write just about the literature, but then I kept finding that these wartime love affairs were sort of seductive and somehow inextricable from the books, and wanted to explore that moment, and then became caught up in this sense of what war does to time and the way that the moment can extend, and the way also that coincides with sort of what literary modernism had been doing before the war. Again, it's a kind of life catching up with art in a sense.
Any other questions? Do we have, there's a lady there.
So I have two questions from you. One is very much related with the topic, and the other one is not.
Sorry, we
The
can't hear you.
mic it's distorting a little bit.
Now? It's okay?
Try again.
Yeah, so I have two questions. One is related with the topic, and the other one is not. But I want to ask this question to you because since you all are women writers, and I just want to know. So my first question is, how do women distance themselves from all that is happening in the city and write about politics and write about other things? How do they write as an individual and not thinking that they're women and, you know, all that is happening in the city? I read Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, and she couldn't distance herself from all that was happening with her in the city. She was writing about politics, but then she was also writing about how she felt as a woman. And she could not stop doing that. So,
We heard bits of that. Is it? Was it sort of about? It's about how women react to war. Is that right? Or is it about
events in the rest of the city?
Sorry.
my question is, how do women distance themselves from all that is happening in the society with women? For example, Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, she was free. She was very much free, but she was not single mother, and she was working. She was a writer, very well-known writer, but she was not free from the male gaze in the city. Women as women have to face a lot of things in the city. So
Yeah,
no, in this culturally
how do women
rooted
distance themselves?
country.
Sorry.
So how do women distance
Themselves.
How do women distance themselves from what is going on, from the horror of it? Is that it?
I think she was trying to ask that women living in cities and the amount of how do they kind of extricate themselves from the male gaze and everything else that's going on to write as an independent woman author, you know, as a liberated woman author, not affected by the patriarchal kind of structure that surrounds her in her day-to-day life.
Is that a question about the writers?
I think it's a generic question about writing as a woman.
Am I still picking up? Yeah. It's interesting that, again, the contrast between Evelyn, who is unable to distance herself. I mean, Alison has wonderful scenes of sort of Evelyn going to the butchers and the fishmongers and trying to work out what there is, and also being very, her husband is the superintendent, sorry, I'm answering.
Yes, no, thank you.
No. But being very sort of caught up in that structure, where I think my writer, Elizabeth Bowen, is married, but is very independent. She and her husband are often sort of separated. She's dashing off to Ireland. I think, yes, it is a lot easier for her. She is able to enjoy, she talks about the people in London as sort of campers in drafty rooms or flats. She's able to enjoy the independence of war. And in the heat of the day, her sort of great wartime novel, her main character Stella is her equivalent, but she also includes a woman called Louis, who's her sort of alter ego, who is subsumed by fear, who sort of reads the newspaper anxiously, whose husband is off fighting, who doesn't quite sort of know what...
Does she have a child?
No, she doesn't have a child.
So that seems to me one of the great divides.
Yeah.
You can be so much more independent if you don't have children, both mentally and in every other way. I mean, the horror of sort of trying to bring up, like Evelyn.
And also what you pass on to your children as well at that sort of time. I'm hugely interested in the sort of phenomenon of casual prejudice, and in my novel that I think comes through because the boy Philip, almost gets infected by this casual prejudice, and that snowballs into pretty horrible
I think
events.
but can we have time for one more question? One last quick question. I think there was a lady there, or a young gentleman.
Yeah, I would just like to know what your books are called, because I'm very interested.
You would like to know
what your books are called?
Wonderful. Very good question. Excellent
So one
question.
is The Love Charm of Bombs, and the other one, lovely title, Unexploded.
Unexploded.
And both wonderful titles.
In good bookshops, including
That's right.
the one.
And both, do read them. These are both staggeringly
and mine
good
actually
books.
comes out in paperback in February, which might be a more enticing prospect.
I used to have very, very long titles on my other books. I thought, I want just one word. Nobody trips over it in introductions.
Yeah. There we are. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you from everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Artemis.
Thank you so much, Alison, Lara, and Artemis. We'd just like to present you with a token of our appreciation from the Jaipur Literature Festival, some beautiful scarves.